our first speaker of the day, which is Matthew Reason. So Matthew Reason is a professor in theatre and performance study and theatre and performance and director of the Institute for Social Justice at York St. John University. Matthew's research includes audience research, theatre for children and young people, theatre and learning disabilities, and cultural policy. His work is often undertaken in collaboration with arts organizations, and he's interested in the use of creative and participatory research methods to explore the impact of art practice. Matthew has also co-edited a really important book on liveness, which I'm sure will come up in his presentation. And so his thinking has been very influential also during the conceptualization of this project. And the other thing I want to say is he's also got experience, has worked extensively interdisciplinarity with other cognitive neuroscientists already. So there's also a wealth of experience on that front. So we're really excited to have Matthew Reason starting our session today. And with that, I'm handing over to you.
Thank you very much. Thank you for the introduction, and thank you for having me here, wherever here is, and now, wherever now is for all of you. And obviously here and now, that kind of joining together of time and space is a kind of classic traditional articulation of liveness, isn't it? The singularity of time and the co-presence of space. But we're finding in all sorts of ways that gets exploded and manipulated and played with in all different ways. So in a second, I'm going to share my screen and begin the presentation. I have in front of me a piece of paper which has the word "slow down" written on it. But if I fail to slow down at any point, just say "slow down" in the chat, and I will do so. So I'll just pause a moment and get all my technological ducks in a line. Oops. So can I check that you can see that, Guido?
Yes, we can see that.
What I can't see anymore is the chat.
I'll be monitoring that for you.
Okay, I think I can now. Okay, so as I said, I'm gonna begin. This is as a presentation. This is going to be fairly loose and exploratory, potentially occasionally somewhat self-contradictory. It's certainly going to be plural. As you can see in my title, I've gone for the slightly uncomfortable livenesses because there very much kind of isn't one, and we need to think about that as multiple. And it's also going to be kind of conversational in a way. In the first instance, that conversation is going to be with myself, but I am going to invite you to join me at certain points in the conversation in the way that we've been, those of us particularly who've been teaching on Zoom for the last year or so, have been exploring with our students what are the ways in which we can use the different platforms in different ways to communicate differently with audiences. So occasionally I'm going to put up a little red sticker on my presentation, a bit like this one, which is a kind of instruction to you as the audience to join in the chat with a particular question. So we're talking about liveness. So my first question, just for you to think about and to put something in the chat is, well, if we're thinking about liveness, what's the opposite of liveness? I'm going to pause there, partly to check whether you're all listening and whether you're all alive, and see whether there's someone who is brave enough or technologically quick enough to be the first person to comment in the chat about what they think the opposite of liveness might be. So we have inanimate as one suggestion there, so thank you. So when these questions come up, when these red stickers come up, just feel free to comment in chat, and I'll either engage with them and pay attention to them or completely ignore them entirely as I feel like. So we've got static and isolation and deadness and recorded and disconnection and stillness and so on, sorts of nice one-word answers. So thank you very much for that. So we'll keep that going, and we'll look at that. As Guido mentioned, a little while back, myself and colleague Anja Lindhoff edited a book called Experiencing Liveness. And a lot of this presentation is drawn from that book. So I really want to credit Anya as a kind of co-thinker with me in this, in some of the material here. And also actually the other contributors. It's got work for cross disciplines. It's also got practice-based shorts in it. It very much seeks to explore liveness in a similar way to this project, in a kind of an experiential manner. The book focuses, or says it focuses, on not what liveness is, but on how it is and how it matters. And it came out a little bit for myself and Anya out of a sense that sometimes discussions on liveness were stuck. And they are stuck in a particular place in a particular time. And we wanted to unstick them a little bit in a little bit of a way. And one of those stucknesses, I think, was around, and this is why I posed the question, opposite of liveness. What's the opposite of liveness? And it was stuck in a notion of the opposite of liveness was the recorded, and that relationship between the live and the mediated, and lots of technological discussions around that in different ways. And we thought that wasn't useful in different ways. So I'm going to come on to that, but first just to give you a sense of the structure, so you know where I'm going and you know roughly when you're halfway through and when we're near the end. So I've got 4 parts, and as you can see, I've been somewhat self-indulgent in the titles I've given myself for the sections, inspired by the word liveness. I have deadly, I have undead, I have unhuman, and then I have relational. And you can speculate as to what those might be when we get to each one. And I'm omitting here that these are playful. These are seeking to open up the notion of the word, but also recognizing that liveness itself, because it has, do we mean live or do we mean live? All those notions are also fluid and playful and interesting. So hence the deadly and the undead and the unhuman and the relational. So I'm going to take you through that. I think it's going to take me around about 40 minutes or thereabouts, but we'll see how we go. So deadly as the starting point. What if something is not live, then what is it? So this is the question which I posed to you in the chat. We've got other answers there. We've got frozen, non-testimonial, maybe, it's an interesting one. Stuff in a can, I like that one. Perhaps the opposite of liveness is something that has happened, it's in the past and somewhere else. So all those are the notions, but I did notice that a little higher up, someone had put down recorded. And that, I think, is where often the discussion around liveness was stuck in different ways in different places. And in the book, Experiencing Liveness, we posed an alternative opposite. What if instead of thinking that the opposite of the live was the recorded, and recognizing that that was this binary that I think had ceased to be useful. It had produced all sorts of discussions around Steve Wurtzler's notion and really interesting article about the different places between the live, the temporarily co-present or the temporary absent, all the, when in that huge range of possibilities did liveness cease to be live in relation to the recorded. And myself and Anya felt that wasn't really pushing the debate further. So we asked ourselves in the introduction to the book, what if the opposite of liveness was deadness or deadliness? And what would that help us think about in different ways? Now, the word immediately took us to Peter Brook's notion of the empty space, where he introduces the idea of the deadly theatre. The deadly theatre can at first sight be taken for granted because it means bad theatre, writes Brooke at the beginning. And this is a moment I'm going to pause before coming back to Peter Brook in a bit more and exploring what he actually means by deadly theatre, because he makes this connection to bad theatre, but that's not quite what he means. But it's a really important connection, because I think sometimes in our discussions around liveness, essentially what we're talking about is whether we think it's any good or not, or whether we like it or not. So does this statement mean that liveness is simply a synonym for good in the ways we talk about it or the ways we use it? Is it simply another way of saying it's good? And I think that's an interesting provocative question that kind of haunts for myself some of the discussions in this area. So I'm going to repeat it. Is liveness simply a synonym for good? Or more accurately, I think, is liveness simply a synonym for things that we personally like, or experiences that we personally like in that sense? We might kind of have a detour there and wonder whether this is a synonym for a universal, like it should be a synonym that everybody likes in the same way that Kant argues is that beauty is universal, or whether it's always a subjective liveness in that sense. But certainly I think in many occasions and many ways it's used in marketing, in promotion, in everyday conversations. Liveness becomes this synonym for good, or things we like. And there's a parallel, I think, in the ways in which when talking about art and performance and film and so on, we also use words like authentic and authenticity. So when people say that was an authentic experience, or it felt really authentic in a performance, a significant part of what they're actually saying is whether they thought it was any good or not, or whether they liked it or not. And there's a nice piece of research by Radbourne and et al. Who write that the greater the authenticity of a performance perceived by audience members, the greater their engagement with the experience. And I think we could quite easily imagine shifting that around. The greater the liveness of a performance as perceived by the audience members, the greater their enjoyment of their experience. And in that sense, perhaps we can begin to think that liveness becomes used or is a synonym for things that are good or things that we like. And in my research, I've found this in different places in different ways. So the word believable often operates in similar ways, or unbelievable. Things that we say are believable in performance are things that we think were good. And if we say it's unbelievable, we also mean we didn't think it was good. So example quotes from audience members in my own research. I thought she was really believable. It was really good. Well, I thought he was very good. It was very believable. And the switching around of that is clear. Ian Yang in her research in Dallas also sort of similarly found that saying something was realistic meant it was good, and saying something was not realistic meant it was bad. So perhaps there's an element of liveness that has these qualities to it. I want to pause a bit and share again an audience response, and this time from a production of Othello. And this was a project I did where I asked people to draw little spider diagrams around specific memories. So they put a memory in the middle of the diagram and then expand around that with all the thoughts and connotations and memories and experiences that they had from it. And these were teenagers in Scotland watching Othello as part of a school trip to see Shakespeare. So when asked to write down a memory in the center of the circle, this teenager wrote, "When Desdemona was killed by Othello, it seemed so realistic, exclamation mark, exclamation mark, exclamation mark." And around that, you can see the spiraling descriptions of the experience. Everyone in the audience seemed so interested at this point, with their eyes were glued, says the top one. Or at the right observes that at this time, even the crisp packets and juice bottles were no longer being heard, and the descriptions of notions. So in some sense, the description here of it being realistic, what they really mean is they didn't really believe that Desdemona was killed. They just meant it was believable. It was good in some ways. So that notion that this is a synonym for good, I think, is present here. But there's something else. I don't think we simply using liveness as a universal or direct exchange for that notion of goodness. There's a particular kind of goodness it's describing. So it has got that connection, but it's describing the particular qualities of an experience that we seek out and engage with and desire, that give us that feeling of satisfaction, that feeling of goodness that makes us like this. So what are those qualities? And that, I think, becomes what we should be researching and looking at. What are the qualities of liveness in our experience of it? And I think we have elements of that within this description here, where they've described, and they've got their little key at the top, this meant my feelings at this point of time, and they've got the word captured, excited, tense, shocked, nervous, scared. And they talk about the atmosphere, they talk about the tension of the eyes being glued, they talk about people kind of being on the edge of their seats. So are these the qualities that we might associate with a live experience in different ways? And again, in the chat, I want you to think about that question. What does liveness feel like when we experience it? Maybe in words that kind of echo or are different to this teenage audience. When we experience liveness, what are the qualities of that experience that we have for ourselves? So again, just add those to the chat, and they may be different for different of you, whether it's intense emotions or multi-sensory or wherever that may go in different ways. And I might come back to some of those in a bit. So if we're looking at the qualities of liveness, we're no longer saying, okay, there is this connection to the deadly, but it's a bit more than that. So I want to come back to Peter Brook, and he expands a little bit on the deadly theatre. So the deadly theatre, he writes, takes easily to Shakespeare. Nice irony, given my example just now. We see his plays done by good actors in what seem like the proper way. They look lively and colourful, there is music and everyone is all dressed up, just as they're supposed to be in the best of classical theatres. Yet secretly we find it excruciatingly boring. In our hearts we either blame Shakespeare or theatre as such, or we even blame ourselves. I think there's a lot of really interesting notions in there. One, he's observing that deadliness can occur in live performance. It can occur in even those performances which seem to be doing all the right things. They seem to be lively, they seem to be colourful, they may be a multi-sensory, there are all those things going on, but actually they're excruciatingly dull. And I think this is a controversial statement to me made in a conference or seminar about performance and from a professor of performance, but we've all had those experiences. We've all had experiences where we've been to a live performance and it's anything but live in that experiential sense. It's mundane, it's mediocre, it's just we watch it, we finish, we go, and we never think about it again. And those for me might be live in a literal sense, but they're not liveness in that sense. So in our hearts, we either blame Shakespeare or theatre or ourselves. And I think what he's describing is that deadly theatre or deadliness is the result of a failed relationship between the performance and the audience. And that's kind of a key notion which I'm really, really interested. That notion of the relationship, clearly it's in my title about relational livenesses, the exchange, the encounter, the meeting, the entanglement between performer and audience, between work and audience in different ways. That, for me, is what liveness is, and that stops it from being deadly in Peter Brook's terms. So we've got other comments there. Potentiality, experiencing unexpected experiences, suspension of time while feeling alive, and I breathe, I see, I hear, I touch, I sense more. So that's from deadly, we come to this notion of, okay, it's in the encounter, it's in that entanglement. And that if deadliness is the result of a failed relationship between the performer and audience, what is it that makes a successful relationship? What makes a live relationship in different ways? So part two, the undead. Now, clearly here, I'm just playing with words. I have deadly, I must have undead. But there is some seriousness within that indulgence as well. Occasionally for me, it has felt that liveness is a bit like Dracula, in that in my own research, I first wrote about liveness in 2004 in a paper that came out of my PhD, and at various points since then, I've tried to leave it behind, but like Dracula, it refuses to be killed. Or perhaps it's like Dracula in the sense that even when Oslander has fairly systematically attempted to slay what he terms kind of bourgeois, sentimental descriptions of liveness, it continues to rise again. Undead, not alive, what do you mean? Is this all a nightmare or what is it? So liveness is undead in the way that it keeps on returning to me and it keeps on returning to our discipline in all sorts of ways. But also maybe more interestingly, perhaps liveness is undead in its relationship to technology, which is that if in a notion of an oppositional notion between liveness and the recorded, no matter how far into kind of the complexities of technological relationships, liveness resists. Liveness always seems to be coming back. It doesn't seem to me matter how unlive something can be or how undead something can be, but it still somehow becomes liveness. So we might think of liveness, of live performance, as an obvious, as a common sense definition, is it's about that co-presence in time and space, the person up in front of the other person. And we can think of that as being so untechnological. We don't even need the technology of a book or the technology of a screen or the technology of anything. We can have that in our day-to-day lives. So if liveness is non-technological, but yet no matter how many layers of refraction or technology we put around or in front of performances, we still find ways to find liveness. Or indeed in the middle of a pandemic, no matter how much performance has been shut down or closed off, we still find ways of finding liveness. Like Dracula, it rises from the undead, and we find it in all sorts of places and all over the place. And we do find it all over the place, all sorts of different kind of technological undead engagements with liveness, whether that is from kind of very old, now the live album, to our engagement with live sport, to hologram tours of dead artists, to the National Theatre Live, to the RSC's recent explorations of virtual performances. All of these are kind of, they all have, or they all seek liveness, and the liveness they seek is that experience, that encounter, that meeting between audience and performer, that's performance and work. That's what they're engaging with when they say live. They're making that promise, they're making that commitment, that idea of some kind of relationship between the work and the audience in all sorts of different ways. Now, I have to confess that during pandemic, I haven't engaged with a whole lot of theatre. There's been an awful lot of Netflix to watch, but I have been watching a few things. And one of the particular ones I engaged with quite early on was a poet I like called Holly McNeish. And if you don't know Holly McNeish's work, I want you to find it immediately. And I'm just going to play you a little bit of Holly McNeish on Instagram Live, another undead occurrence of liveness. And as we listen to this, you can either listen or you can write down in the chat, what have been your best experiences of undead liveness during lockdown? Those experiences of liveness which have risen through different forms, or where you found that live encounter in different ways. So I'm just going to play this and hope the sound works and give my voice a rest for a second as well.
Hey everyone, I hope you had an all right week this week, a good week, a great week. Mine was all right. So yeah, for anybody that is joining for the first time, every Sunday at 9:30 for 15 minutes, I'm going to read one poem I wrote and one poem I love. So yeah, I'll get started. It won't actually always just be one. I've just said that because sometimes if it's a really long poem, then I'll just read one. But if they're quite short, then I'll maybe read a couple. So tonight I'm going to read 4 poems, 2 that I wrote and 2 that I really love. So yeah, cheers. I will get started. Cheers, everybody. This week, I've got to say, in lockdown, I'm generally sort of all right being at home, although I miss people, like I'm sure everybody does. But this week, I just really want to go to a party. So I thought I would pour myself a glass of wine, and I'm going to read a couple of poems about parties, and then I'll read a couple of poems by other poets that make me want to go out as well. So yeah, cheers to having a wine with you. Oh, good. Well, cheers, Hayley. Oh, so nice. All right, I'm going to start with, I'm going to read poems from these 3 books today. And I'm going to read a new one to start off with. So this is a poem that I just wrote, basically, because I was sat at home and I wanted to go to a party. So once we can, if anyone is having a party, I would love an invite, if that's possible. Okay, so this poem is called The First Night Out After. Missing a good house party, yeah. Me too. Right, so first night out after. When this is done, at least done as much as viruses can linger, when fear is somewhat settled, as low as fear can lay, when rooms are opened once again for friends to whisper close to mouths, music loud enough for leaning conversations, I will not hesitate again to pull out from my wardrobe those outfits bought but never worn, for fear the glitter twinkled a little too excitedly for simple flesh like mine. No longer, I will cry, throw the tracksuit to the floor that I have worn for a whole year now, only taken off to wash. I will yank those glittered dresses, dust off the turquoise boots, ignore the mirrors mocking, walk arm in arm with friends, as if the pavement to our local pub were carpeted in red.
So that's Holly McNeish, and at this point, when you're doing an online presentation, you realize, is anybody out there? Is anybody listening? And that liveness of mutuality kind of is really difficult to gauge online. But what Holly does is she plays with the form. She plays with what I describe some of the materiality of liveness. There's an intimacy, there's an authenticity, there's a realness, there's a presence, there's an immediacy, there's a closeness, even though there is a distance there as well. There's a kind of what I describe as a closeness in the sense of Walter Benjamin, the closeness of aura, no matter how far away the actual distance. That proximity, which isn't maybe a proximity in space, there's a proximity in emotion, proximity of relationships, proximity of presentness, and all those elements. So I also was engaged when I was watching Honick Niche. I was attentive, I was co-present in all those different ways. And while that may partly be simply a synonym to this is the stuff I like, the qualities of it that I liked were these qualities of liveness in different ways. And I think in that sense, again, we can think of liveness as the result of a successful relationship between performer and audience, but successful in working with particular qualities, particular material qualities of liveness. And in that bucket of stuff, we can see how Honick Niche was working with those. She was, I'm sure not deliberately or inauthentically, but she was playing with notions of intimacy, with inviting us into her house, with ab-libbing, with that kind of mutuality of exchange, as well as with those direct moments when she read from the Instagram comments and so on. So there's an undeadness to liveness in that even something which kind of resists or moves away from the here and now, the co-presence of time and space, can play with the materials of the live and can bring it in that way. So liveness, in that sense, is unkillable. Or rather, more seriously, liveness resists. Oops, sorry, my technology is there we go. Liveness isn't unkillable in that sense, but rather that there are lots of ways in which the non-live, the not quite live, the almost live, or in my language I'm playing with here, the undead occasions, in which liveness remains the best and most apt term to describe the kind of relationship that we have with it. We have this sense of liveness that describes the qualities of our experiences. And the reason why the term returns and returns and returns, both in my research and within the discipline as a whole, is because it is the most apt and most appropriate term to describe that particular quality of the intimate, the mutual, the co-present, the immediate, the closeness, and all of those kind of elements which we play with and explore in the live experience. So for me, liveness is undead, is unkillable, because it is useful and vibrant and a meaningful concept to describe our experiences. But it's only so if we free it from a kind of ontological attempt to nail it down, where we say that liveness is the property of a live performance, or we free it from unhelpful binaries, where we say liveness is the opposite of the recorded. And instead we focus on the experience, on that exchange, on that interaction, on what we might think of the entanglement between audience and work, or audience and performer. So my next section is called Unhuman. Now I admit I only called this Unhuman to fit with the form of the deadly, the undead, the unhuman. Really, I would call this the experiencing the more than human world as live. And I'm putting this in here as a little bit of a parenthesis, a little bit of an example of what I might mean of an entanglement of liveness in a place where we might not traditionally think of liveness as the description that we'd be looking at, because it doesn't involve people. It's in liveness with the unhuman. But it invites us to think more about experience and experiencing liveness as a going out and between the spectator and the work, that encounter, or to repeat the word, that entanglement. And in thinking of this in my own research, in my own thinking, I've drawn on a whole range of kind of thinkers and writers. I really like John Dewey's description as experiences as not just things that happen to us, but experiences of things that we engage with, that we make cohate, that we complete through our attention. And I like Margaret Wetherall's description of how we are effective meaning makers through paying sustained and attention to our affective experiences. And I like Vivian Sobchak's description of how we experience the world through a sensorium, and that we both have sense and make sense. And all of those, I think, describe the ways in which the spectators engage with work in a kind of audiencing. That's the work of the spectator in making the experience, in making liveness. So the example I'm going to take very much again comes from the Experiencing Liveness book. And again, I'm going to credit Anya. This comes from her chapter in the book on environmental performance. And in particular, she writes about a whole range of examples, but one is James Turrell's sky spaces. Some of you may have witnessed these. They're all around the world in different, particularly in kind of sculpture parks and museums and art galleries. This one here is pictures of the one nearest me, which is in the Yorkshire Sculpture Park, and it's the deer shelter. And it's essentially built in an old deer shelter in a hill where you walk into this room, which has a feeling somewhere between an auditorium or a mausoleum. And there's no windows except cut into the ceiling at the top is a square space, a window, a gap out into the sky above. And there's seats which are positioned in a way that encourage you to look up and to look out at the sky above and engage with that in a particular way. Now, in a second, I'm going to read an extract from Anya's description of liveness in relation to environmental performances. And I thought as we do it, it might be fun to play, sorry, just skip that, just to play the live stream of a James Turrell sky space. I thought that would kind of be inappropriate as a notion of an undead liveness. Unfortunately, the live stream of the sky space is no longer working and is not live. So we're not going to do that, and I'll play your video instead. But as you watch this and as you read, I'd like you to have a think about, have you got any moments or experiences where you've experienced the framing of life as art? And has that ever given you a sense of unhuman liveness, engaged with liveness in different ways? So I'm going to play a video just of a recording of the sky space, and again read you some text from that. So this is from Anya. She writes, experiencing liveness in environmental performance is the experience of time passing. Live experiences of environmental performance emerge where and when a framing of the world's unpredictable meteorological, zoological, and biological processes come together with a heightened awareness of the world as unfolding in the present. It is, however, not the durational qualities of the living world which produce effects of liveness. We may persistently attend to plants and flowers growing and blooming in our garden. We may watch the repetitive rise and fall of water in ebb and flow. And indeed, we will likely experience such situations as taking place here and now and in real time. However, we will not likely experience and describe them as live. Liveness, in other words, is not a product of the living world as such. Rather, it is a product of a certain framing of the world, combined with a certain heightened awareness and response in a certain moment. The experience of liveness is a relational event, where a certain framing of the world combines with a heightened awareness and response to the inframed world. Liveness is a unique time-space of aesthetic exchange, where the very relation between the world and the perceiver is accentuated. And I think that last description there from Anya is for me a really nice description of what I'm interested in, and I say relational livenesses. So liveness is a unique time and space of aesthetic exchange where the very relation between the world and the perceiver is accentuated. The relationship between us and our sense of watching, our sense of experience, and the work of the world or of life is accentuated. And all those qualities which I've described of liveness, those qualities of intimacy, of closeness, of mutuality, of presence, all of those are accentuated. All of those happen all the time around us, but we often don't pay attention to them, don't engage with them in the same way that James Turrell's sky space frames the world and encourages us to engage with that in that heightened way. So one of the roles of live performance is framing and asking us to engage in a heightened way, in different ways. Okay, last section. So by now it should be really clear where I'm nailing my colors. Livenesses is relational. It's not simply in the thing or in the work. It's not an ontology. It is not simply a time and space, a here and now. All of those things have great potential to be deadly, dull, to be deadness. And similarly, in the reverse, there are all sorts of places and occasions in which things which are not fully live, which are only live-like or in some way or another undead, are experienced, beg your pardon, with a kind of liveness in those different ways. But it's also just not a synonym for good. There's something particular. There's a particularity in that encounter between the spectator and the work that fits in with our notion of and our description of liveness. It's a going out, a to and a from, an in between, a betwixt the work and the performer that creates this liveness. So I'm going to start repeating myself in different ways here, I'm sure. To think about liveness is to emphasize particular kinds of engagement, particularly qualities of experience, and particular kinds of entanglement. And these might include, if we consider a kind of a bucket of stuff, a bucket of things we can use when we think about liveness, it might include a sense of co-presence, it might include a mutuality, it might include a closeness, but not necessarily a physical closeness, a kind of proximity, a uniqueness, a sense of time being now, a sense of time being important in all sorts of ways. And these, again, to stress, are not simply properties of the thing, but are properties of the encounter, of the exchange, of the entanglement, of the relationship that's created. Now, my conceptual grounding and drawing on this is broad and varied and kind of eclectic. So I might think of different ways we can root this into various kind of philosophical traditions. Martin Buber's exploration of what a real conversation is, involving mutuality and genuine surprise, as opposed to where we have lots of false conversations, and his description of the importance of I-thou relationships, where we engage with the other in a full sense. That connects to Liveness's description of how in face-to-face encounters we take responsibility for each other and for the otherness of the other person. Or Fischer-Lichter in her description of the autopoietic feedback loop, that self-generating moment of learning and exchange that she describes as happening within the live performance. Or Rancière's description of how the emancipated spectator who is empowered to compose her own poems with elements of the poem before the her, and that relationship between the audience as the active receiver and maker of the work. And even Oslander, who having moved beyond kind of a discussion of the relationship between liveness and mediated, in a later work on digital liveness, writes that it is in the audience experience rather than the properties of the thing experience that is the locus of liveness. And a small critique here of Oslander, I'd say that while he says this, he does nothing towards investigating it, which is where projects like this are so really important. And it's why, even though he says that, liveness in that debate became stuck in a discussion about the relationship between the live and the mediated, instead of a relationship between the live and the experience. So a full embracing of liveness as experiential will require the kind of thinking across methods and across approaches that I think that this project is proposing. So, last slide. So having said those 4 sections, I'm going to add a final one, which is a kind of so what, a where next. And in this, I was also looking at the way that this conference has framed and coming up with the 2 next sections on measuring and practice. So I was wanting to give a couple of thoughts around that in different ways. In terms of measuring, maybe we should look for liveness as experience in all sorts of different places and find those similarities of those qualities and responses I've been talking about in surprising places. What if we can find that sense of proximity, that sense of closeness and the aura of that in all sorts of different places? If we can find it in a live performance, but we can find it in listening to the radio or reading a book, or we can find it in a film. We can find that quality and we can still describe it as a liveness in those ways, because what it produces is a particular kind of experience, a particular kind of attention, a particular kind of entanglement. And maybe we should actively look for those in a way to describe that. And in terms of practice, what I'm interested in, and I've described liveness as a material, and I like that again because, well, liveness is intangible, surely. How can it be material? But maybe in practice, we need to look and think about how artists are using the stuff of liveness. That's the stuff of the form of time, the form of proximity, the form of duration, of closeness, of distance, of mutuality. And they're using that as a material to create relationships that produce particular kinds of effects with the audience. So with that, thank you very much for listening, and for those of you who contributed into the chat. And I think we now have about 20 minutes for conversations and discussions.
Thank you so much, Matthew. Wow, that was very, very rich. And so slightly blew my mind, so not quite sure how to start from there. But there's a lot of really amazing comments and thoughts in the chat, which I'm not quite sure that we could go through all of them. So I guess what I would like to do is I would like to invite comments. So if you feel like you want to sort of make lift up or sort of bring forward some of the thoughts in the chat into the discussion, or to Matthew directly, maybe raise your hand, or if you don't want to speak, maybe put it into the Q&A as sort of more of a formal question. While we're doing that, so while we're waiting for people to sort of maybe put their questions into, put a question into the Q&A, or comment into the Q&A, or raise their hands. Maybe one way to sort of get going is that I really was taken by one of your first thoughts around the idea, in what way is liveness different from goodness more generally, and sort of like that sort of as a response to where I immediately think, oh, there's a neuroscience angle that I can help with. So there's an angle that I can say, if it is really just another form of, you know, goodness or pleasure, then that will have a very different pattern if we were to measure people's brains while they're doing that. So that's just like one thought that came up for me. But also, yeah, like really that as an empirical question, that's an empirical question that we could answer and clarify.
Yeah, I think in terms of measuring and that, it's interesting. When I first wrote about liveness, which wasn't my intention, so it came out of my PhD, and I published this way back in 2004. So that was not long after liveness, the book Liveness by Auslander. And about the same time, Martin Barker wrote an article about crash and liveness, and so Martin Barker's mainly a film researcher. And Auslander had a blog post, which I tried to find for this because I wanted to quote it, but it's no longer online, in which he commented on the strangeness of having people attempting to measure his conceptual ideas. And that, I think, is another interesting question, because he was saying, you know, why is this guy Matthew Reason and this guy Martin Barker attempting to measure my notion of liveness? So sometimes, you know, what is the relationship between posing a conceptual question and posing a measurable question isn't always literal or direct, and that certainly in my own experience of interdisciplinary work, it's interesting how those putting things together and putting them in parallel, and how can they cross and how can they interconnect, is always really rich and complicated, and not necessarily a straight line.
Yeah. Thoughts, comments, questions from others? Anna is commenting on. Thanks for fascinating talk, Matthew. Anna, would you like to sort of say yourself? Then I'll sort of add you quickly if you're happy to. Then you can pose the question yourself if you're happy to.
Hello. Thanks so much for the talk, Matthew. It was great. Yeah, I'm just curious about the kind of notion that liveness might be a kind of special way of paying attention to phenomena, and whether, I mean, some of what you said suggested that might be a good way to think about it, and whether you think that is indeed a good way to think about it, or whether maybe liveness is about paying attention as distinct from not paying attention to what's going on around us.
Yeah, I think it in part, yes, in all sorts of ways. So to give a totally mundane example, if you know, we during lockdown we tried to sit down and watch a film with my family and my kids, and if they're on their phones and multitasking and all sorts of different things, the heightenedness of us watching film together dissipates and is lost and is no longer special. And my attention is lesser because their attention's lesser, and we don't have that co-joined sense of co-presence and the kind of that watchingness on it. So there's definitely a way in which the heightened paying attention to something, whether that's framed through James Turrell's Sky Space, or framed through everybody having to look in the same direction in an auditorium, or framed through us being asked to think actively about something in a different way, creates this kind of heightened or accentuated paying attention to something that I think kind of in a Venn diagram crosses over a lot with notions of liveness in all sorts of different ways. So yeah, so in that sense, you know, you could similarly say the screenings. I remember going and seeing a screening of Braveheart in Edinburgh when that first came out, and the kind of the audience attention there, and you know, they had kind of moments of shouting out to the screen. It had a liveness to it because of a heightened attention in that sense. So yeah, so we can again find that heightened attention in all sorts of ways. See, I'm sympathetic to that. I think sympathetic again how that is again a description of a certain kind of goodness, but it's got particular qualities to it that fit with that in different ways. I think there's probably kind of objections we can have to it as well as a notion. It doesn't quite fulfill everything, but it certainly goes a long way. And I think someone's been in the chat about joint attention and focus. I don't know any of those references, but that's certainly something within theatre and performance studies is written and talked about a lot. You know, that the joint eye of an audience, the collective gaze transfixing the performer. Performers certainly talk about the feeling of the intention and gaze of the audience and feeling whether they know an audience is with them or not with them. And certainly when you present online, you lose that sense, don't you? Because you can't tell whether people are with you or not with you. So yeah, so I think that's those references there kind of fit in with that in different ways.
Mm. There's a question in the Q&A from Susan Sandler, I believe. Thank you so much for your presentation. So much resonates with practice. I co-share with my colleagues Glenna Bates and our co-teaching on Zoom that has been so exciting. Yielding liveness, working with Zoom in its materiality. Can you write or repeat the book's quotes you mentioned throughout? That's probably a question that can both be typed or sort of answered in question. But Susan, if you want to, do you want to elaborate? If you want to elaborate verbally, then we can also sort of give you the microphone if you would like that.
There's also a question from Chantal, which I think is quite an interesting one. Just come back in the chat that I can talk to if that's useful.
Sure. Yeah.
So this, I think, so this Chantal's asking, thank you for the question, whether the thoughts on the ideologies of whether theatre itself and liveness are part of something that challenges or resists capitalist power. Now, my connection to reading from that is this is a strand or a notion within Peggy Phelan's articulation of liveness as becoming itself through disappearance, and particularly within that, the notion that through that it resists commodification. I think it's interesting conceptually. I also think it's probably not true. I think there's all sorts of ways in which capitalism and consumerism and marketing commodifies liveness. I think, you know, even so Peggy Phelan's writing particularly about live art, and I think even live art has begun to commodify its own liveness in all sorts of ways. Maria Abramovich has been doing that in different senses. And I think capitalism, you know, the thing it does best is co-opting things that are supposedly resisting it. And I think the way we can see those, the multiple ways in which liveness is sold to us suggests that it doesn't. So that's my take on it, which is kind of rather blunt in some ways. Yes, I think it's interesting, but no, I don't really think that's necessarily the case. We might like to think it is because we're into live performance and we maybe not so into capitalism, but I don't think that's the case. I can think it can be used all sorts of other ways. The question around whether you're a spectator on your own or whether they're in a large group of people. I think there's all sorts of interesting writing and work on intimate encounters, on one-to-one performances, creating a particular kind of liveness, of interaction and exchange. We published a chapter, I think by Rachel Gom, on intimacy and one-to-one performances and liveness in there. But there's something about that liveness that creates that intensity of that encounter. But equally, if you're in a big audience and they're all paying attention and they're all engaging, that again creates a different kind of intimacy. So there's possibilities from both directions in that way. But certainly that collectiveness creates that heightened attention in different ways. Pleasure, I think, is also a really nice one to bring in. The pleasure of liveness, the pleasure of joint attention, the pleasure of a sense of intimacy, of all those things. Absolutely, I think there's a pleasure to experiencing liveness that drives us to go out and seek it again in some ways. So yeah, and I've written about pleasure in that sense as well. But one of the discussions we had in the Watch and Dance project I took part in was that the kinesthetic pleasures that people get are actually quite different and varied from each other. So one example we had was with contemporary dance audiences and ballet audiences, and description of contemporary dance audiences seeking a kind of a pleasure of sweat and sinew and effort. And ballet audiences often using a language which was about pleasure of etherealness and grace and ease and so on. And that being quite different pleasures that again from dance in different ways. So I just realized, Guido, there's questions in the Q&A and questions in the chat. So
yeah. So switching, there's one from CJ now. It speaks as well to the idea of death being something, something negative when we could be viewing it more in non-Western terms and thinking about how we process death and nothingness.
I think there's probably more than I have the expertise to speak to in that. I think when I was using undead, I was doing it playfully, and actually when I said there's undead, it wasn't critical in a sense of being negative. It was more kind of thinking about the ways in which all the distances we could put between something being live and us still having qualities of aliveness with it. Different time, different place, you know, and it's still returned. But yeah, I think there's probably something interesting in the way that within English language, live and live are constructed, which must be different in different languages and different cultures and different ways.
I'm just seeing a comment from Evelyn. Evelyn, do you want to join the conversation maybe? I'll give you the opportunity. You don't have to, obviously. I'll see if I can find you. If you want to comment, so you've come up in a few places now. Maybe you want to sort of comment yourself. Oops, I think you're muted. Now I can hear you. No, I can't. We should be able to hear you, but we can't hear you. Now we can hear you.
I can't hear you anymore. Somehow.
Now we can hear you.
Yes. No, actually, I was very much interested in this idea of liveness being something that could happen being completely like out of sync potentially with each other, because the recorded does like it. The live performance, so to speak, is not elevated above the recorded, right? So in fact, you could experience that. And I really like this idea of it being just a quality that could really just pop up at any time and place. And I was wondering about this like out of syncness, like how that could be like generated and like manipulated in some way, if it's simply a quality.
I think that's interesting, because you could then start speculating about all sorts of possibilities of how can we construct live like or that experience of liveness without having any literal liveness at all. And that's what I meant by the notion of it being a material, in the same way that a sculpture works with clay or stone. A live artist works with this materiality of liveness, and to use that and to construct that in relation to an audience. So I guess that's a question for practice to explore, and I think practitioners have been exploring that in all sorts of different ways, in different fashions. So one I remember was this is ages ago. I've forgotten his name. French Canadian, big large scale Robert Lepage piece in which at one point in the performance, you weren't certain whether you were seeing a projection of him on stage, or a live relay of him on stage. You know, it wasn't clear which one it was in different senses. So some of it was pre-recorded, but you couldn't tell what was pre-recorded, what was live feed, what was him. And at the end of it, there's this amazing reveal that he had a body double, and that was this other, you know, and that kind of playing with it was really interesting. So I think that in an experiential quality of intention and relationship and entanglement is where for today anyway. I'm nailing my belief.
Yeah, and the idea of the frame and how how far can you manipulate this frame in order to indeed play with these different qualities? I think it's a really brilliant aspect of the talk.
I've just spotted a nice question from Anna in the chat about, so when I said that performers say they can feel the audience are with them, are they ever mistaken about this? Does this reveal something about the limits of relationality in performance situations? That's a really nice one because, I think it's Carolyn Heim, an Australian researcher who's just done some work which involved quite extensive interviews with performers about that sense of an audience being with them, their perception of an audience, which I think was quite a nice reversal of maybe the tendency we have. And when I was reading that, I was continually thinking, but yeah, maybe they're just lying to themselves. Maybe they can't really tell. And I guess the question would be, how on earth would you measure whether they're mistaken or not mistaken? We might ask us similarly as a lecturer in a talk, when I do a talk to students and they're in the room, I think I can tell whether they're engaged or not by their faces. But you know, maybe I'm mistaken, maybe I'm not. So I think that's a really interesting question that maybe from a neurocognitive science point of view, you'd come up with, well, what is the way in which we can measure that as well? So that's interesting. Thank you for the engaged feedback there.
Just another question coming into the Q&A. Simina, do you want to, I'll read it out. Let me know, put up your hand if you want to sort of comment or say something yourself, otherwise I'll read it out. The idea of the spectator as constructing their own experience reminded me of scene construction theory. It suggests that the hippocampus continuously and automatically creates scenes from available sensory and semantic information, and this underlies both remembering and imagining. I was simply curious whether you were familiar with this theory or whether the idea of continuously creating scenes in our mind has been perhaps formulated in other ways by artists rather than cognitive scientists. Unfortunately, I'm not able to speak at the moment, so I can only write up my thoughts here.
So the short answer is no, I have not heard of scene construction theory. The longer answer, so whether the idea of continually creating scenes in our mind, I don't know. I mean, it's interesting that with some of the work I've done, so I've done some work with children as audiences and spectators, where I've asked them to draw me images of performances. And I've always wondered and been curious about that, about whether what they draw, so sometimes they draw things that they didn't see on stage, they draw things that they imagined or things that were connected to the performance, or maybe they draw the performance, but they draw it from a different angle. So there's one which drew the scene from above. And I've always been curious about whether they had those thoughts or those scenes before I asked them to think and engage and reflect on them. And I think what I'd be interested in there is this when are those scenes constantly generated in different ways? It's not a very formulated answer to the question, probably because I don't quite know what scene construction theory is.
I think what Simina refers to is it's come up in a different, funnily enough, in a sort of different conversation I had earlier, is the idea that the hippocampus as a brain area sort of does generate sequences and is sort of the place where sort of all different sources, sensory sources, whether they're auditory, visual, sort of come together and get combined into an episode. So it's the idea that the hippocampus is very important for episodic memory. So and that's so the idea of the construction of a scene, and that's come up. It's a sort of very prominent. It's a very prominent area of research at the moment. It's come up, interestingly enough, in a different area this week when we talked about dance and choreography and how they relate to each other, which is sort of a different area. We're sort of done with this morning sessions. So I think it's probably a good moment to to wrap this one up. Thanks again, Matthew, for this amazing presentation. Really rich and lots of things to thought. So quick applause round. Silence, non-silent. Really looking forward to continue this discussion in the open discussion later this afternoon. For now, we have a 15-minute break before we start our second session with Danny Richardson and Ryota Nomura. I'll see you all in 15 minutes. Thanks a lot. Bye.